Okay, so we've had a really full day. Thanks to everyone again for attending and for bearing with us. It's been, I think, really energizing to hear from all of our panelists, and I'm really excited to be joined in our closing panel by the heaviest of heavy hitters.
Look at the pressure.
Who I will briefly introduce in turn. I do just want to note briefly that we all come from, I think, different disciplines and vocations, and we may even have some friendly disagreements on the panel, but we come to this discussion with a shared aim. And this is something that I think Andrew mentioned in the opening. That aim is to sharpen our analysis of racial capitalism such that we can more effectively intervene in the profound crises that we face, hopefully dismantle it and replace it with something far more equitable and better. I'm going to introduce the panelists from left to right. Jordan Camp is an assistant professor of American Studies and co-director of the Social Justice Initiative at Trinity College. He's the author of Incarcerating the Crisis, Freedom Struggles and the Rise of the Neoliberal State, and the co-editor of Policing the Planet, Why the Policing Crisis Led to Black Lives Matter. Ntanya Lee is a longtime community organizer committed to building up US-based social movements that can meet the needs of oppressed people and advance the struggle for liberation. And Ntanya is the National Secretary of LeftRoots, an organization of social movement leftists working to rebuild the US left in these times. Directly to my left, Nara Roberta Silva is on the core faculty of the Brooklyn Institute for Social Research, where her research and teaching focus on the areas of social movements, global Marxism, post and anti-colonialism, and the links between classical and contemporary sociological theory. Welcome to the three of you. The first question, and we're just going to go in this order again. So the first question is this, that each of you will answer. What is the nature of the historical moment in which we find ourselves now in relation to the neoliberal project of the past 4 decades? To what extent are we in a different moment politically than we were, say, 10 years ago? And what is the significance of that difference?
Yeah, well, good evening. How's everyone doing? Great, thanks for that. First, let me thank John and all the people who are involved in the organizing for the invitation. I'm really honored to be here and energized by the conversations throughout today. So I'm going to try to do it justice by jumping right into it. So the current moment represents a crisis of neoliberal hegemony and perhaps the worst crisis of legitimacy for the US state, at least since the defeat of Vietnam in the 1970s, and maybe since the overthrow of Reconstruction in the South in the 1870s. Antonio Gramsci referred to crises of hegemonies as moments where the ruling class has lost its consensus. That is, no longer leading, but only dominant, exercising coercive force alone. In our present moment, marked by the spectacle of relentless racist police violence, the US state's failure to contain the coronavirus pandemic, a resurgence of the far right, climate chaos, spectacular unemployment, and the largest refugee crisis since World War II, the ideology of American exceptionalism has unraveled, which has caused the US state to suffer from a profound crisis of legitimacy at different geographical scales. In this historical context, neoliberalism is unable to command the consent that it once did. As the intersecting crises in the United States have intensified, there's been a rapid expansion of right-wing paramilitary organizations and other militia, vigilante, and authoritarian nationalist groups. The law and order agendas of the past 4 decades appear to have evolved into a white nationalist insurgency that crosses the boundaries of the nation state. The challenge of the present moment is to locate the historically and geographically specific ways in which a tilt towards authoritarianism has been facilitated and justified through racist and nationalist ideologies, both nationally and globally. So while there are different ways to theorize the moment that we find ourselves in, I think the most effective way is to theorize it as a conjuncture. This approach was developed by Gramsci as he grappled with the rise of fascism in the 20s and 30s, and Stuart Hall as he grappled with what he called authoritarian populism in the 70s and 80s. And it enables us to understand a conjuncture as less a slice of time and more, as Hall put it, an accumulation of contradictions. So once a conjuncture unfolds, he writes, there's no going back. So today I want to suggest Gramsci's relevance for understanding racial capitalism, even though he never used the concept. I argue that Gramsci developed a historical and geographical method of what he called conjunctural analysis for analyzing the dialectics of class, region, and political economy and culture, including the articulation of racism and capitalism. Gramsci's conjunctural analysis provides a way of recognizing that the relationship between racism and capitalism takes distinct shapes in particular historical and geographical contexts. Gramscian analyses of race and class complicate the most influential narratives about neoliberal capitalism today. Neoliberalism is more than an economic project to restore class power. As I've argued elsewhere, it's a political project of unpredictable class rule that deploys racialized narratives of security to justify itself in the face of insurgencies from below. The social consequences of this project have been manifest in nationalist articulations of race and class, linked with racist political ideologies about crime and law and order that paved the way for the rise of a neoliberal carceral state. Racist narratives, as Christina Heatherton and I have explored, facilitated the implementation of neoliberal policies, offering discursive strategies that rendered poor and working people simultaneously less worthy of the state's shrunken largesse and more deserving of its expanded punitive capacities. The success of these strategies, in my judgment, is unimaginable outside of the context of a counter-revolution against freedom struggles in the US South and other regions of the world, as explored by Brooke Flood and Dr. Omaria today. The battle to preserve Jim Crow capitalism was waged by Southern Democrats, or as we were explained, Dixiecrats, like James Eastland, a wealthy plantation owner from Sunflower County, Mississippi, where the infamous Parchman prison is located. He's also known as the voice of the white South and an avowed white supremacist. He articulated a law and order rhetoric to criminalize the freedom struggle, which was subsequently taken up by politicians like Barry Goldwater, Richard Nixon, Ronald Reagan, and Donald Trump. This didn't just start in the 1970s here in the city. This has been critical to shoring up consent to neoliberalism. Neoliberals simply seek to impose a neo-Confederate bloc strategy of development developed in the US South on the rest of the country and the world. So far from anachronistic, as work by Nancy McLean, Clyde Woods, and others shows, the neo-Confederates were the original neoliberals based on their hostility to social welfare programs, anti-unionism, commitment to property supremacism, tax resistance, and a belief in a more authoritarian forms of carceral governance. The consequences of this strategy can be seen in the current moment, and we are in a new moment. Whereas Jillian Hart argues, we have witnessed literally a war between forms of neoliberal hegemony to neutralize popular antagonisms from the liberals and the populist one that seeks to mobilize them through racist and nationalist and gendered far-right projects. Understanding this conflict, I think, is the challenge that we face.
Thank you. I want to say Jordan and I are not best friends or comrades, but he kind of, we're like in the same chapter of the same book, which is just beautiful. That's just a really beautiful discovery. So let me just actually start with not only just gratitude for the conversation, a conversation about dismantling racial capitalism at this really important historical juncture in the state of the world. But let me just say a little bit about who I am and how I answer the questions the way I do. I'm from a working class Black family in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, and from folks who came up from Louisiana And my grandfather slaughtered pigs for 40 years in the meatpacking plants. And I was raised in the defeat of the Black left in the 1970s and raised within the rise of neoliberalism alongside simultaneously the continued radical aspirations of my family and my people. And that meant that I was raised in a home where my mother yelled things at Ronald Reagan on the television that I cannot repeat here. But I was lucky enough to channel my rage and pain about the suffering that we were experiencing as poor working class Black folks in an industrialized agricultural city like Cedar Rapids into organizing. And that I found organizing as a place to build power with other oppressed and working class people. And I did that for more than 20 years. And I'm also in West Philly, the kind of sister on the block who both stands up to the addicts who want to approach my family and talks to, also organizes the people on the block to make sure that we are not the people who incarcerate the addict who showed up and talked to my, And so I'm the auntie on the block who both is a hellraiser and who hugs every baby in the neighborhood. And I'm, as a long-term experienced left organizer and socialist, I believe that we can win an alternative to racial capitalism in this country. And that belief is not an idealist one, that is a belief based in the science of human transformation and the history of liberation struggles across the world. And I bring that belief in the possibilities of human transformation and social transformation to every conversation I go to. So to answer this question, from a structural assessment of the system, we're still in a globalized system of racial capitalism and empire, but we are situated in the particular context of US racial monopoly capitalism. But this question was about this moment. Capitalism, racial capitalism is a historically created system. It was created by humans. It's historically contingent. It had gone through many different phases, and we're in a long, what I would consider a long conjuncture that began in the 70s of neoliberalism, but a particular phase of that conjuncture, which is, I would agree, a crisis of hegemony, a crisis of legitimacy, in which the neoliberal order has broken down its legitimacy, and both there is a deep questioning of the logic of the system from the right and the left. And that began in about 2008 at the crash, and began to be observed on the left in the uprisings, obviously around Occupy and then Black Lives Matter and many of the other insurgent sort of rebellious movements that have happened since that time, but also in the deepening, broadening and consolidation of the authoritarian right at the same time. Those are both features of the crisis of legitimacy that we face. On one hand, this radicalization in this period of this last 10 years means that as a longtime organizer, there are young people who've been coming into this movement in this period who have very different politics because they were raised under neoliberalism in a way that I was not, actually, because my mother wasn't raised under neoliberal conditions, and I was sort of raised under the Black radical tradition. And now we have activists who are radicalized by the political moment and yet not raised by the people who really led the Black radical struggle in the 60s and the 70s, and have very radical but very hyper individualist neoliberal ways of being and showing up in the work at a different time. And not insignificantly, part of what marks this particular moment, which is very different in US history in this last 10 years, is that we have increasingly radicalized young people and activists on the left, but we have not resolved the basic challenge that neoliberals put to the left in the 70s, which was to say there is no alternative to capitalism. They made it, there was part of an ideological offensive as part of this past conjuncture to say socialism failed, alternatives to capitalism are not worth struggling for. It's called TINA, there is no alternative. And what we have now is a generation of highly radicalized young people without a sense that there is an alternative, without a North Star, which is highly disorienting and highly disorganizing. And that's part of the state of the left and part of the state of US social movements and why so many of our organizations are just falling apart. But that's another conversation. So what part of this moment on the left anyway, I mean, on the right, of course, in the correlation of forces that we can see in the conjunctural analysis is that the right is winning. Now, with all respect to DeMario this morning, the right is winning in the correlation of forces. The left is weak. The left is fragmented. The left lacks the sort of inspirational popular strength that so many parts of the left have in the global South. And that is just the truth. Now, that doesn't mean we can't rebuild it. We can't build mass movements that are capable of advancing struggle, but we can't advance if we don't face reality. And the lack of the weakness of the left explains so many things about the struggles of, what misinformation, despair, so many of the struggles that people are having is explained by the fact that the left is not sufficiently able to assert leadership in this country right now with an alternative vision of a different kind of world where people can be humane and have full solidarity with one another, where we can actually face the challenges of the ecological crisis that we're in a way that is deeply felt and feels exciting and inspiration to people. It is our charge to do that. We have to do that or we're basically lost. And so one thing I would say, in addition to that about the nature of sort of the political moment is that what this means, and we can talk about this in terms of what to do, but the significance of having that assessment of the correlation of forces and the fact that the right has grown strength while the left, even though there's all this radicalization, has not consolidated its strength, means that we have to deal with strategy. Because what that means, we have to have shared strategy because we can't afford, those of us with progressive and left politics, to do random ass shit. We can't afford to do things that make us feel good, that serve our egos, that appeal to the funders. We actually have to have strategy that makes us make hard choices about what we do, and so that we can go from being in a position of weakness to a position of power.
Oh my gosh, I feel you said everything. Okay, so first, thank you so much, John, everybody who is organizing this space. Thank you so much, Ntanya, and thank you so much, Jordan, for sharing this moment with me. I'm actually a little bit inspired by what you said at the beginning of your trajectory. So I just want to actually make clear, if you didn't notice, I was not born in this country. So I'm gonna try to offer here very briefly a perspective that actually reiterates a lot of what the two of them have said, but also framing it a little bit more from a global perspective and using also a little bit of my background as a sociologist. So I think to me, neoliberalism should be understood above all as a response to a crisis that became evident towards the late 1960s and the early 1970s, right? So it's a crisis of economic accumulation, but it's also a crisis of international politics that was set out with the rise of the third world following national liberation struggles. So the institutional changes, the regulatory changes towards what is then, what was then accepted as free trade, free markets, etc., that was forged with neoliberalism, offered, in my perspective, a safe reintroduction of the global South into the world economy, and then maintained an imperial order that I think at that moment was severely challenged, right? So I think with the benefit of hindsight, right, we can see neoliberalism as very much cohesive, right? But the neoliberal agenda actually has evolved amid some discontinuities, some readjustments, right? So I think you were saying in the panel right before this, like how unpopular these ideas were, like in the 1970s, right? So it's important to see how actually there were these shifts within the arc of the project, right? If you want to like a very concrete like example, if you think of Reagan, Bush 1, Clinton, right? You're still maintaining the system, but you are actually making adjustments about like in the project, right? So then it took a while, in my perspective, for neoliberalism to assume what is arguably its most profitable, successful shape, right? Which I associate as very much to the cosmopolitanism of the 1990s, right? So that lasted roughly like this 20 years, right? Let's put this way, like till beginning of the 2010s. So like to refer to one example, I'm from Brazil. So cosmopolitanism, the appeal of globalization actually was then very strong, to justify the openness of the markets to external investors, right? So, but then when you actually see, right, that the constellation of crisis of today that Jordan referred very openly in his remarks, and I'm sure that today this was very much explored, right? So when you think about this constellation of crisis, it required actually a new adjustment, right? A change in the tone of the project. So let's drop multiculturalism, let's drop the melting pot, right? While the flow of capital, and this is very important, is still secure, right? So the rejection, so then in my perspective, the rejection of globalization by the right, not by the left, right, is to me like the most remarkable aspect of the historical moment in which we find ourselves, right? So if we consider then the arc of the neoliberal project that was alluded to in the question, right? So the left had has, right, its own critique of globalization, but I think that the rejection of globalization by the right, I think is truly remarkable for shaking the cultural and ideological landscape. So like who would imagine, right, that we would be discussing, I don't know, flat earth, you know what I'm saying? Like, I think that's the type of situation that we are, like the very impossibility of having basic conversations, like basic shit. Sorry, I'm actually sorry. Okay, so, but then there's the thing, right? So like this irrationalism is not like random, right? There is an actual function in this seemingly, apparent irrationalism. So the recent reconfiguration of the cultural and ideological landscape within, the neoliberal project over this last 10 years, right? I think it has allowed the project to proceed despite opposition, right? Despite dissatisfaction. Right? And, or maybe like proceed by dislocating, right? The opposition and dissatisfaction, which I think is, the things that the two of them explored like really well. So then I think like moving more explicitly to what this means to us, like to the world that we envision and our organizing, I very much agree with you. I think I think it's very important to like stress that there is a difference, like to recognize the difference between making advances and like putting some brakes on catastrophe, right? So like there is like a very important difference in this. So I think the current stage of neoliberalism did witness some wins on the side of the left, right? So like a couple of weeks ago, I was celebrating the Lula won. I think that that's important and we should like cherish that and treasure that, but, not take the forest by the tree. Is that the right expression? Yeah. So like the right wing today frames the conversation. Like they frame the conversation, and the left has been pushed to a position of reacting within this frame, right? And I don't think I don't want us to be afraid of like saying that. I think we have to say that. I think it's not to like throw a nice bucket on anybody. It's just like a realistic assessment of our forces, will indicate I think we have to have a sense of that, in the sense of the magnitude of the task that we had ahead of us, right? I don't want to be inflammatory. I want to be like very clear about that. Like there is a very important historical task ahead of us, right? So we are on the verge of like catastrophe. So if we actually, and then like the previous panel, right, there was this conversation that in the end, I think is a very, a very common conversation in the left, like reform, revolution, etc. I think that in the end, right, this moment is like really difficult because we actually have to deal with two tasks whose pace actually do not coincide, right? So on the one hand, yes, I mean, we have to like put a brake on these immediate attacks. Like this is necessary, like nobody's diminishing that alleviating, people's like the suffering is important, especially now. If you look around, like all these crises that are happening, this is important. But if we do not think about an actual alternative to neoliberalism, we are going to be walking circles again. We are going to be cornered in the way that I think we are, right? So it sucks, but that's that like the dual task, right? It has to be that. I'll stop now. Sorry.
That's right. That's right.
Thank you all. We're going to switch the order, so maybe I'll ask the next question slow. We're going to reverse the order, I should say. So if you want to just take a deep breath, Nara, because you're about to be up next. I did not spring that on people, by the way. That was planned. So the next question is, how does the analytical frame of racial capitalism help us think about the tide of authoritarian nationalism that's been ascendant over the past decade?
Just an easy one,
Just
right?
Another
very
easy
easy one. Okay, so so the way that I will respond to this question, I see actually fundamental affinities between racial capitalism and authoritarian nationalism, right? And I want to explain this statement by talking a little bit about the logics of racial capitalism and authoritarian nationalism. So bear with me a little, okay? I'll try to be as clear as possible. So I am sure that throughout the day, folks here at this conference have explored, the idea that saying that capitalism is racial is not simply to acknowledge that racial groups are treated differently within the system, right? This is true, but this is what we see. This is what is on the surface, right? Saying that capitalism is racial is to acknowledge the fundamental role of race in enabling the development of capitalism, its space, its continuity, right? So capitalism reinforces racial hierarchies in its ordinary moments, right? So you have to have a racialized population. So you address capital's needs of continuous margins of profits, right? These are guaranteed through the existence of racialized groups. And you also see capitalism reinforcing racial hierarchies in its extraordinary moments, right? Moments of crisis. So the turn towards mass incarceration with neoliberalism, for example, or the defeat of reconstruction that enable a new moment of accumulation in the US, right? So at the heart of capitalism, actually, there is a drive to fragment and to differentiate, a drive to demarcate boundaries, to create others who can then be dispossessed, expropriated, conquered, removed, displaced, all the things that that were discussed with very clear examples today, right? So throughout history, I hope someone will address that, but throughout history, such a drive to differentiate, to fragment actually manifests differently, right? I think like the role of the state in each moment is also very important, but the drive is there, right? So, and then when I turn to authoritarian nationalism, I actually see a drive to towards othering very much there as well. Right? So authoritarian nationalism refuses any commitment, right, to particularities such like languages, religions, native communities that could be eventually, right, embraced under a shared national identity. Let's remember that one of the things that is powerful about national identity is that they seem, very natural, but they are actually in dispute and they are shaped. Right. And for authoritarian nationalism, when actually engaged in this shaping of the national identity, the point then is to elevate one supposedly like quintessential, like truly American, truly Brazilian, right? One truly whatever identity, right? So then what or who doesn't correspond to that, right, can be suppressed. So the synergies between the two of them, actually, it's scary, honestly, right? It's very scary. So then I actually want to take a step further and stress that is not a surprise that capitalism, because of its inherently racial nature, would give room to such a social and political form as authoritarian nationalism. Right? This is not a surprise. So like very explicitly to the answer, like the frame, like you asked, like how does the analytical frame of racial capitalism has, help us think about the tide of authoritarian nationalism? Honestly, like the frame of racial capitalism makes crystal clear to me that authoritarian nationalism is not an aberration, is not a point off the curve, right? It's instead, it is truly possible or even expected, that I say, right? An expected development of capitalism coming out of the guts of capitalism, which is always racial, right? Like instrumentally reinforces the boundaries that capitalism needs to draw, like boundaries that are both like metaphorical and literal, right? So anyway, so I think that these conclusions, I think it's a conversation that we can have, but I think that these conclusions reiterate the point that I mentioned before, right? So I think we have to extrapolate the framework that thinks that it's possible to address authoritarian nationalism without addressing the existence of racial lines, right? This is the same task. Like if we get caught in this sort of like liberal thinking that in today is very tempting to do that, right? Because we have to save democracy, but it's very tempting to actually hold on to this frame, right? But like liberalism as this political philosophy, as this, that is translated, right, in liberal democracy, this is not going to save us. Like you cannot act in stages. Like let's first guarantee these liberal freedoms, and then let's think about something more radical. This, again, as I mentioned before, is going to make us like keep, walking circles, because the authoritarian nationalism that we are seeing today is, was bred by this liberal system. I'm going to leave it there.
Yeah, thank you. That was a good note to end on there. So I'm actually going to leave I'm not going to address this. I wrote up something, and then after today's conversation and realizing who I was going to, it's like, okay, I'm putting actually what I wrote aside, and I'm going to take a slightly different angle on this. I think, so first of all, I think in sort of in jest, as an organizer and a person who mostly is looking at politics in this country all the time from an organizing lens, seeing having the framework of racial capitalism as a way to understand the structural nature of this society, and then is important in general. We need to be really rigorous about and I love the things that Robin Kelley has said, and like racial capitalism isn't like capitalism with like an adjective. It's not just, but anyway, that's a whole, but also then helps shape how you think of the solutions and how you think of the kind of campaigns and political struggle you wage now, in addition to how you understand the forces against you, like the authoritarian. And in jest, I think part of one way of just looking at that is that if you really look at the history of racial capitalism in this country, you know, for Black folks, it's like authoritarian nationalism is very familiar in that it's basically what we lived under in the South in particular after Reconstruction, and that it was very close to a fascist state. And so what people, and not only because it was racist, we all know it was racist, but in terms of the way in which race was mobilized and used in the structuring of the economy of the South, and then who were the economic elites and people who ran the economy in the South, whose labor was extracted for whose benefit, and the level of political suppression of basic democratic rights for Black people, and of course, Indigenous people as well. That is our lived experience in very recent historical. So it's not so far to be like, what happens? So it's sort of like they're coming for everybody instead of just coming for Black people, is one way to think about it. Okay, but that's a little bit in jest, a little bit serious. But how we think about racial capitalism. So one thing, I just want to say a couple really basic things. I don't know totally exactly who's here, but I want to say that if you think capitalism is not racialized at the level of, as a Marxist, we would say at the base, is at the level of in the economy, in the way basic economic relations and capital accumulation happens. If you don't think that capitalism is racialized there, then in a political context, you would do something like organize workers and say, we don't need to talk about race. We don't need to talk about the particular experience of racialized people of color in the organizing. And what has happened in this country is then Black workers are asked to put aside our sense of peoplehood as a Black people, the particular ways that capitalism has impacted us differently from other racialized people. And we're asked to put that to the side for the sake of the class struggle, for the sake of, right? And this has been a failure of the US left for many generations and has been unsuccessful. So that's one thing that would happen. But on the other hand, if you don't get that, if you don't get that white supremacy helped, is also, so another side of it is that if you are someone who sees white supremacy as the primary enemy, if your primary concern is to end racism, then you will do things like build power as an organizer, organize Black people and build power for Black people, maybe even Black working class people or poor Black people, but you will fail to have a class analysis of the position of Black people, and you will fail to have be able to differentiate the different class interests of different Black people. And then you will build Black political power in the interest of Black elites, which has happened all over the world. And let's not do that again. You know, like, I'm just saying, you know, like we know that story. We know that story. Can we not do that again? So for me, these are kind of there's a theoretical important thing that has concrete influence on how we run politics, how we understand our struggle. And then the last thing I want to say about that is about non-reformist reform, the reform versus revolution. So there's, you know, as an organizer, I'm a left organizer. I'm part of a tradition where we do something called non-reformist reforms. And if you have an understanding of racial capitalism as racialized capitalism, then you want to wage non-reformist reform campaigns that make something possible, that make material conditions change, both in the nature of white supremacy and in the nature of class relations. You want to do both. You don't want to do one or the other. You want to do both simultaneously. And you want to, so non-reformist reforms are things that change material conditions for oppressed and working class people, assert an alternative logic than the logic of capital. For example, housing is a human right, not a source of profit. And that builds a level of organization and leadership of the people impacted. So not just the working class in this case, but you need to build the level of organization and power of Black working class people, for example, right? And that it's not going to be okay just to build the power and organization of Black elites, you know, the Black Hollywood. Like, who cares if they have more organization and power and leadership? That's not actually going to help. That would not be a reformist reform. That would not meet that definition. I'd love to talk more about that later. Yeah, so I think there's many other political implications of seeing racial capitalism in this way that are shape my daily practice as an organizer and movement builder. That I'm going to just end it there.
Well, thanks to both of you. It's really helpful to kind of sharpen our analysis and dialogue. And let me just say, I'm totally flattered by that, chance to be on Team Ntanya. So this is really good. I mean, I think it's useful to think about how the theory of racial capitalism was developed in an earlier conjuncture, the 1970s. Cedric Robinson was mentioned earlier. He was a key to developing this. Also, Neva Alexander, as Christina went into this morning, and others in South Africa. Also, it's developing in Britain with a number of exiles from London. Arun Kunani has written very well about this. I think the challenge is to translate the insights that they developed in that moment to meet the challenges of our own. And I began, thinking about these dynamics while working as a graduate student with Cedric Robinson, who was a member of my dissertation committee at UC Santa Barbara. Robinson was a part of this generation of intellectuals who were studying Marxist theory to come to grips with the relationship between racism and the development of the world capitalist system over the long durée. So he was interested in understanding global capitalism as a system. We're not just talking about American problem. C.L.R. James might say it's a whole lot of nonsense. So while Gramsci had grappled with the rise of fascism and the specific historical conjuncture of Italy in the 20s and 30s, Robinson, Stuart Hall, Sivanandan, Angela Davis, Neville Alexander, and others, developed their insights with the tide of authoritarian nationalism that took shape after the defeat of the US in Vietnam, and also the then worst economic crisis since the 1930s. And I think also the then worst crisis of legitimacy since the Civil War, since the US had been beat by the Vietnamese. So in this context, they developed an understanding of how the development of world capitalism had been shaped by the particularistic forces of racism and nationalism, as Robinson put it. So to theorize this dynamic, he deployed the concept of racial capitalism to theorize the ways in which racial ideologies, and these are his words, permeate the social structures emergent from capitalism. I'm closing that quote, particularly focusing on the political and ideological construction of regional, ethnic, and cultural differences as, quote, racial ones, unquote. Now, it's important to understand why he put the term in quotes, right? It's to signify that racial ideologies themselves are premised on a number of conceits. They're unsustainable. It is true, as someone said earlier, that race is a political and social construction, I would argue, though. And Robinson explained how these racist ideologies, not just racialized, racist, justified the expropriation of indigenous land, the exploitation of enslaved labor, and the concentration of wealth in colonial empires, the basis of capitalist accumulation on a global scale. So in my own research, I've tried to take this up and extend these insights in dialogue with Gramsci and of Stuart Hall to provide a conjunctural analysis of racial capitalism. I'm working on a new book I'm calling The Southern Question, which I take from Gramsci. It tries to argue we gain a deeper understanding of the renewed specter of nationalist and vigilante violence like we saw on January 6th, 2021, or in Charlottesville, or the hundreds of other cases we could point to, through this kind of analysis. The resurgence of the racist far right, in my judgment, is a sign of a morbid symptom of a much broader crisis. And I want to argue that nationalists and populists have positioned themselves as a ameliorative force around the world in response to this crisis. And they've done so, as the sociologist Walden Bellows says, by eating the left's lunch. That is, they have incorporated elements of left-wing criticism, and we ought not get distracted by this. They'll be anti-war, you know? They will say they're against globalism, of course. They're for the working class. They'll now talk about the ruling class on Fox News or Marjorie Taylor Greene. This is a billionaire-funded right-wing project. We have to, you know, follow the money on that. But we also neglect, to our peril, the degree to which this apparent opposition to globalism has attracted broad popular support, and not just by the mythical white working class. Let's understand this, right? We cannot underestimate what's popular about this. Right-wing movements in the United States and across Europe and across Latin America and Africa and Asia have coalesced around this crisis of narrative and betrayal. So while, let's come back to the US. Trump's been voted out of power. Good, you know, let's keep him out since he's declared again. But these moves have accelerated a global shift towards more coercive forms of state power on one hand, and in our own context, an alliance between a hegemonic fraction of the Republican Party and Oath Keepers, Proud Boys, and other right-wing groups and militias on the other. And we should remember, as Gramsci teaches us, that militias are the fulcrum of fascism. So I think a conjunctural theory of racial capitalism can enable us to grasp the articulations of racism, of right-wing counter-revolution, and of law and order in this decisive conjuncture. At the same time, a conjunctural analysis can help us understand how the neoliberal state's authoritarian resolutions of crisis have done terrible damage, but they frequently backfired. And we've seen this since 2020, widespread protests, you know, amid the COVID-19 pandemic and Trumpism have laid bare the inability of racial capitalism and the neoliberal carceral state to solve social problems or meet the demands of movements. So in periods of systemic chaos like our own, and I'm using this from Giovanni Arrighi and Beverly Silva, there's a growing demand for anti-systemic solutions to systemic problems. So in this decisive moment, the question is how we might develop analyses of racial capitalism adequate to the challenges of the present. And as Renee Hatcher argued earlier, the task is also to demonstrate that the project to dismantle racial capitalism must be anti-capitalist.
Thank you all. That was extremely powerful. And I fear that I'm about to annoy you all because as a lowercase d Democrat, I feel the need to choose the room over my dear panelists with their food here. And I think there's maybe wine. So I'm gonna collapse. I'm gonna take moderator's privilege and collapse the final question into your closings and ask you in like a minute or two, Jordan first, to tell us, this is about to be the annoying part. You thought it was before. How we dismantle racial capitalism.
I appreciate your face. Appreciate your face.
Yeah, sure. Well, look, I mean, in a way, I want to go back to Stuart Hall, who I think is one of the finest interpreters of politics. And he always talked about developing an analysis of the balances of the relation or the correlations of forces so that we can more effectively intervene. And the task is not for me to give you the answers, but for all of us collectively to go into the neighborhoods, to go into schools, to go even into the legislature and develop an analysis of the situation and to push for the kind of change that we want. As Hall put it, conjunctural analysis forces you to look at many different aspects in order to see what the balance of forces is and how you might intervene. So I want to just say though, you know, John wrote a really important article in the South Atlantic Quarterly where he says we're in a moment where the state is more open to transformation than it's been in decades. And I totally agree. He shows how that took place in New York City. They were able to harness the law to press a challenge to property supremacism through rent law in particular. And I would add to this very useful formulation for challenging property supremacism, that we should also challenge the analog to gentrification in the city in the form of the carceral state in the rural places. The geographer Jack Norton points out there's been a shift over the last 3 decades, with the bulk of the incarcerated population in New York is not here, but it's in upstate counties rocked by capital flight. Montgomery County has had consistently the highest rate of incarceration between 96 and 2015, he teaches us. Did you know that? So how are we going to build alliances between the struggles in these neighborhoods and the upstate counties? In other words, take on what Gramsci called the Southern question and build alliances at different scales between the urban and the rural, from New York to Sao Paulo to Johannesburg to London and beyond.
Hey, thank you. Thank you for listening. I think really what my final thought to say is that to transcend pessimism, really, to the times that we are in are incredibly dire. And we all are here because we know we need systemic solutions to the crises that face us. And without a sense of strategy, it can be overwhelming to figure out what the hell to do. And so my call to you is we need to strengthen our local grassroots organizations, our unions. We need to strengthen our own organizational forces, but we need to do so with the sense that much more is possible than the immediate campaigns that we are waging. That those immediate campaigns, those immediate alternative institutions, those are all absolutely essential, and they're completely insufficient. And so to transcend our pessimism so that we can actually, maybe not we may not be the ones, let us not be so ego invested, but we collectively as a people can build the kind of society that our children deserve, and that baby right there deserves, and my 16-year-old deserves, and that our ancestors would be proud of.
Thank you. Okay, so I actually want to take a cue from what would be our last question for this panel, because I do think that in the end, I do think that we have to build majorities, right? I do think that we have to build alliances, but then the point actually becomes how can we construct this, how can we actually carry out our fights, knowing that the system absorbs us differently, right? Unevenly, right? To refer back to like the conversation that I explained before, like the drive to differentiate, to fragment, right? So, so constructing these majorities would actually imply, uniting those who are positioned distinctively and have different immediate goals, right? So, and then the word solidarity was mentioned in the previous panels, and I had this in mind very much, and I have this in mind when I think about racial capitalism. In the end, we cannot get out of this issue, like we have to build solidarity, right? But then what actually that means, right? So we should not consider solidarity abstractly. We should not think about solidarity as the right thing to do, right? I think the person who taught me about the author who actually taught me of solidarity was C.L.R. James, when he was talking about actually the revolution in France and the revolution in Haiti. At any moment, he said that white workers helped Black people, right? So white workers were in their own struggle, right? And in the unfolding of that struggle against the old regime, there was, the realization that there was a connection with the struggle that Black people were carrying out in the colonies, right? So in the unfolding of the struggle, it was visible what racial capitalism actually hides, that the fate of one group is connected to the fate of another group, right? So then actually, we have to build majorities, we have to construct majorities, but this is not the point of departure. This is not the starting point. The majority is the process and is the end, is where we're going to get at the end, right? It is what you're going to produce. So the point then, how do we streamline the emergence of these connections, right? As thinkers, as organizers, as people who actually want to destroy this system. That's it.
Thank you all so much.